Now, if you mean by vision, Jesus was really raised, but he appeared in sort of a holographic, non-physical body, and everybody saw him as a tingling, shiny image who gave them a message, and that message is usually said to be, I'm alive, I'm okay, take the gospel to the world, we'll be together someday, I'll prepare a place for you, and, we'll meet. If that's the kind of message we're talking about, I'll concede. Unlike the other questions I've given, this was a popular view about 30 or 40 years ago. And a lot of critical scholars believe that the evidence was for resurrection was so good that they embraced resurrection, but they didn't want to go all the way to bodily, so they have this semi-luminous or luminous kind of body. But it's been questioned severely in recent years. In fact, I just did a count recently. There's about a 3-to-1 move today favoring bodily resurrection, about 75% of scholars, over those who take this luminous view. Now, let's keep in mind, everybody in these two categories believes Jesus was raised from the dead. The argument is over the nature of the resurrection body. That's about 3-to-1. You say, well, come on, 3-to-1 doesn't prove anything's right or wrong. It doesn't. But usually a lineup of scholars tells you where the best data lie. And so why would we think he was raised bodily, as the scripture says? There's a number of arguments. But one is the tomb is empty. If the tomb is empty, it shows that what happened to Jesus happened to his body. And that right away points in a luminous appearance of Jesus would be, once again, a full tomb view, not an empty tomb view. And so a luminous Jesus would indicate that we shouldn't find that body in the tomb, but it's gone. So there's a little disparity there. We have to have something to do with the body. A huge argument has been published in 2003 by the British scholar N.T. Wright, and in his book Resurrection, the Son of God, he argues for about 500 pages the meaning of the word anastasis and its sister term, egeru. These two terms, anastasis and egeru, the words indicate not just resurrection, but bodily resurrection. And he advances a very, very interesting theory. If you check all the sources that use anastasis, Jewish, pagan, Christian, they all use anastasis the same way up until about 200 AD, which of course is after Jesus and gets us up to the Gnostic period. And the way they use anastasis is it's the body that's raised. So if you want to say, oh no, anastasis can mean luminous appearance, the weight of the evidence comes crashing down on you, because Wright argues that there's not even a single account that, when inspected, would take that theory. And if there's one or two of the dozens and dozens we have, I mean, his argument is that even pagans, they believe in ghosts, they believe in luminous appearances, but they don't use the word anastasis. So when they use anastasis, they mean bodily resurrection. So those are some real strong concerns. Also, the latest research, even done by some scholars down on the left side of the spectrum, I'm talking about John Dominic Crossan, Garrett Ludeman, Jonathan Reed, they argue that the New Testament text is plainly a language of sight. And I think this is a heavy argument. It's a language of sight, and it's a language of palpability. And you can disbelieve it. You can disbelieve it, but you have to do justice to the language. And the writers, even Paul, they say, the writers are teaching bodily resurrection. That includes Paul. So I think, keeping in mind, all the people in this discussion believe in resurrection. I think resurrection, the accounts that we have, favor bodily resurrection. Well, you know, I question comments like that for this reason. If someone said to me, no matter who the person was, here's the first thing I say to them. You know, I've taken great pains to give you first century sources for what I'm saying. Could you please give me a first century source that says that Jesus was not stabbed seriously? Well, the word can mean that. Great. All right. So do you want to base a whole theory on a secondary meaning of a word? I want to know historical data. Now, they say, well, how do you know they pierced him? How do you know when that means a deep piercing? Because they got water and blood. You have to stab far enough in to get water from somewhere. Water doesn't just flow from the human body, but the pericardial sac around the heart contains several cc's of watery material. You got to go deep enough to get the results that are there. Plus pricked. There's a little problem here. What's the purpose of the Roman soldier? They came to the two men on each side of Jesus. They found them dead. Sorry, they wanted them dead. They smashed their ankles to induce death very quickly. They come to Jesus. They found he was already dead. So the point of the spear thrust is to say, you're not getting by on our watch. Boom. Now the purpose of it, as we find in many other cases in the ancient world, is a coup de grace, a wound that will ensure death. I don't even know what the point of pricking skin is with a sword or spear. I, revisionist type theories like this really bother me because there's no data for them. They just make an off-the-cuff kind of comment. We're supposed to supply evidence for everything. They don't have to supply evidence for anything. They can just make a comment. And then I want to know, what was the point of pricking the skin by a Roman soldier? His point is to make sure he's dead, and that receives a deep thrust, and that's exactly what the text says because of the response of the blood and the water. Okay, back to the pagan parallel type question. There are a lot of beliefs in the ancient world where people can claim that certain peoples believe that their God did this miracle. You have healing miracles, you have virgin births, you have things like this. To me, if we're talking about the resurrection, I have to go back to the earlier question and say that we do not have pre-Christian resurrection claims. So Christians would have no reason. I mean, what are they copying from? If we don't have any evidence, we don't need proof that there are any resurrected gods. But how about other claims, lesser claims, that they took other things from these religions? Here's some conditions we should mention. First of all, scholars allow that while the mystery religions, Mithraism and others, while these other religions spread around the Mediterranean world, Israel was exempted. There was very little evidence of any of that influence in Israel. Secondly, these persons never lived. They weren't believed to live. So when you contrast a living person with a non-living person, you automatically get a major contrast there. You say, well, you don't just say these two people are equals. You got to step in there and make a critique. Thirdly, just because reports, of course there are people who believe their God did miracles, Zeus heals. Of course there are things like that in the ancient world. But here again is this principle I've already introduced, and that's this. Why should Christians be required to produce evidence, evidence, evidence? And all the critic has to say is, there are some other ancient religions that have healings. What about those? Oh, right, they're healings now? That's healings in ancient religion? They don't believe that. Well, did the Christians copy? Oh, well, that's a different thing. Do you see the evidence of copying? Does anybody mention Zeus in the text? Does anybody mention Mithras? Or does anybody mention Demeter and Inanna, or Venus and Astarte, or Isis and Osiris? Without data, I don't understand why Christians sometimes have to just answer everything out of the sun and produce all this kind of data, and all anybody else has to say is, hey, what if? What if? And that's all they've got to say. I see no evidence of copying. In fact, I'll tell you this, a scholar named Barry Blackburn did his PhD dissertation in England a number of years ago, and he did his dissertation on these Hellenistic divine men, a different class of folks who were believed in miracles and stuff. He compared all the pre-Christian ones to the miracles in the Gospels. He found, of all the dozens of cases that could be brought up like this, he found 3 cases with any similarity at all to anything in the Gospels. So it seems to me the duty is on the person to say, well, this, and this miracle are all copied off these mystery religions. And I still want to make the point, we have no resurrection in those mystery religions. So the evidence for the chief miracle of Christianity, which evidences the deity of Christ, that's still unexplained. Well, when someone says to me, how do we know that Jesus how do we know that Jesus was raised from the dead? He only appeared to believers. I want to say, well, who was the Apostle Paul? What about James, the brother of Jesus? Critics allow, we have multiple attestation. Most critics believe that Mark 3, John 7 are multiple cases, multiple accounts, which tell us that Jesus' family did not believe in him. His brothers did not believe in him. So now we find in the early church, James, the brother of Jesus, is the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. How did he get from unbeliever to pastor? The only thing we have is this enigmatic reference, 1 Corinthians 15:7, which critics take very seriously because in this creedal passage that I think establishes the resurrection. In other words, I think you can establish the resurrection with 1 Corinthians 15 passage alone. But in that passage, we read this: He appeared to James. So most scholars believe that the risen Jesus appeared to James. That gives account for his conversion. But the point is, he was an unbeliever beforehand. You have Paul, you have James. Whatever you want to do with, if you believe Doubting Thomas, and you want to think he's a Christian, not a Christian at that time. John has Jesus saying, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. You could argue that in that account, it was John's intent to say that Thomas had not believed before he saw Jesus. I think what a question like this wants is people unbelievers who saw Jesus and stayed unbelievers. We don't have any of those cases. Every time an unbeliever sees Jesus, they become a believer. And I would just say that's not Jesus' fault. That's the result of the resurrection. Yeah, I don't think there's anything in the appearance accounts in the Gospels or anywhere else that supports this luminous, holographic vision of light that we talked about earlier. Don't think any of the accounts. Okay, so he passes through doors. That just says that Jesus had new powers, and I think Christians largely believe. See, when Paul says Jesus is the first fruits of those that sleep, you go, hey, what about Lazarus? What about the Old Testament? What about Tabitha? What about Tabitha is another case, but what about some of these other ones? Weren't they raised from the dead? I think Paul's point is Jesus is the first one to be raised in a resurrection body. Resurrection body has changes. I think that's Paul's point, 1 Corinthians 15. The seed is sown, becomes a plant. Still the same seed, still the same body, but it can take a different form. And that, by the way, I think accounts for why some people did not recognize Jesus right away. But some of his own followers didn't recognize him right away. I mean, it's like a double take we do when we haven't seen somebody for 10 years. But what I'm after here is just because someone's gone through a wall, that doesn't mean it's a luminous body. In fact, let me share something real strange. If there's this luminous body of light, this holographic light vision, do you know that in all the resurrection accounts of the Gospels, there's not a single mention of light surrounding Jesus? Not one. Not one. So I think that's something we kind of put in there with our, the most you get is you get Paul on the way to Damascus. That's very different. That's a Jesus who's been in heaven. Many people place the appearance of Paul 2 years later. I've got a good friend who believes that the difference between the Jesus' body who appeared on the earth and the body that Paul sees is in the meantime it's been transformed. That's a glorious body, Paul calls it, Philippians chapter 3. So the fact that he can go through walls is actually a very glorious teaching. He's got a new body that has new powers. Not anything to say that it's not a body. Not anything to say that it's, some glorified ghost or something. You mean the physical body that we have on earth? Well, I think there's continuity. I've got to say that's the point of the gospel saying, Luke, look at my hands and my feet. John, say, look at my hands and my side. I think the point of the scars is to argue continuity. The point of the scars is to say the same one who's crucified is the one standing in front of you. But like I already said, I think there's also change. And that's why I think some of the followers do kind of a double take, maybe not unlike me not being seen by somebody for 10 years and they're wondering if it's really me. I think there's change. I might also say that in our reference in Luke to the two men and going to Emmaus, they say that God kept them from recognizing him. So there could be a supernatural element there too. Well, I don't think any theory of risen body requires that we think every atom that was intact in Jesus' body, if he had a mole in his left arm, there's going to be a mole in the resurrection body. And then the debate about whether he had organs and whether because he ate he had a stomach. I don't see that question answered in the New Testament. I think we have to push that far. But I will say this: the New Testament hope is bodily resurrection, the same body we have, although it's transformed. So I would say the same body but changed. And you go, how do you go same but changed? Well, I can give you an earthly illustration. Once again, the body that you see 10 years from today is my body but changed. And I think that's a good illustration. But uh, Jesus is transformed. So there are serious, there's some changes that take place, but the point is the body's his, and it was the body that was crucified. Yeah, I don't think the New Testament answers the question. I don't think that verse helps us one bit to answer the question. I think Paul's making an analogy. I don't think Paul's trying to answer a biology question about a resurrection body. So, I mean, if it turns out to be that there's organs, that's wonderful. I'm just saying I don't think we have the data to answer the question, and so I don't get involved in discussions like that because I think sometimes they get pushed to links that we're just shooting from the hip. We don't know. Yeah, I think 1 Corinthians 15:50 is one of the most common verses that is cited to make Paul uh, say that this is less than a physical, heavy, let's weigh it kind of body. And I don't think that does that at all for many reasons. Number one, I've already said Paul uses anastasis and ageru. At 1 Corinthians 15:12, for example, very strong verse. First Philippians 3:21, very strong verse. Paul says Jesus' body is going to be glorified, soma. Why didn't he just say pneuma? He's going to have his spirit is going to be glorified. But he says his soma, that's glorified. I still think you have to do justice to Paul's language. And as far as what does 1 Corinthians 15:50 mean? Someone says, well, hey, explain the text. I think the text explains itself. For 1 Corinthians 15:50, he says, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. And the very next part of the verse, 15:50b, says, neither can corruption inherit incorruption. I think all Paul's saying, and by the way, this phrase, flesh and blood, is a Jewish idiom. It appears two other times in the New Testament. It's a way of saying, for example, Caesarea Philippi, flesh and blood has not revealed that to you. What Jesus means, Jesus is not getting debates about whether a living flesh person told Peter this. He's just saying you didn't learn that from any man. And that's the use of this flesh and blood idiom in Judaism. I think all Paul's saying is in 1 Corinthians 15:50 is simply this: you can't go like you are. You can't go in the body you have now. You got to be transformed. So hence my point earlier, uh, God touches us. There's a change. A seed becomes a plant. Plant's not a seed. Seed's not a plant, but the seed becomes the plant. It's our body. There's continuity, but there is change. You have to get change in Paul, in my opinion, because you got the seed that becomes the plant. That's certainly some change. But Paul's not saying that there's no body here. He said you can't go in your present body. And 15:50b explains 15:50a. He restates it. He changes it just enough so we get his angle. Um, I think the Shroud of Turin is probably, I say that guardedly, I think the Shroud of Turin is probably the burial garment of Jesus. I would give it some kind of low probability rating. I think really the only uh, uh, outstanding evidence against it's carbon 14, 1988. I see that as a serious objection. But just recently, that data, in my opinion, has been exploded until something better comes along. A leading researcher, a chemist, who's not trying to argue that the shroud is a miracle. In fact, he says that view bugs him. He put two pieces of the shroud, one from the 78 test, one from the 88 carbon 14, put them both under a microscope, studied them chemically, and he said, we have two different cloths here. These are not the same cloth. Anyway, his conclusion is what was dated in 1988 has an invisible weave, the kind where you get thread and go through a cut, I mean, in the fabric, a tear, and try to make it look like there's no tear, not just putting a patch over it, but doing this nice little weave. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the scientist Ray Rogers estimated that of what they dated in 1988, about 60% of it is the date of the original shroud, whatever that is, and about 40% of it is medieval. Hence, we get a skewed date. And a lot of people don't realize that there was a secret dating of the shroud in the early 80s, which the scientists don't think right protocol was done, and they don't cite this, but it was done in a reputable laboratory. And as I recall, as I was told, the two dates that came from this were 30 AD and 70 AD, plus or minus. So I think the carbon 14 has had some serious question cast on it. I think the shroud looks decent, but I wouldn't sit there and say it's got to be the burial garment of Jesus. I think people doubt the resurrection for at least two other reasons. It's not, in most cases, not the lack of facts. Watch debates when evangelicals debate non-evangelicals. It's usually, I'm prejudiced, but I think there's a very clear victor in most of these. In fact, they often take votes on secular campuses. This is done on the critics' home turf, so to speak, and it's often an embarrassingly large score for the data. I think it's because facts are not where most doubts are. I think you can whisk a lot of facts away by saying, what if? Well, do you have any evidence for that? No, but what if? What if I have cancer? We just had a test. I know, but what if the test was wrong? Well, it's not. We just did a test, but tests aren't infallible. What if? And that kind of emotional kind of doubt can be paralyzing. There's another issue. That's volitional doubt. I think there's three basic kinds of doubt: factual, volitional, emotional. Volitional doubt might be something like this. Well, I can't tell you what happened with the resurrection. I don't know. You got something going there, but if you're asking me to become a Christian, that's not my cup of soup. I'm not ready to come to Christ. That's a volitional thing. So all I'm saying is, we assume that people accept and reject for factual reasons, and seldom is that the case. We don't accept because we can prove it. We don't reject because we can disprove it. We accept or reject because that's what we want to do at that moment. So it comes from some other area. And I think it comes from emotional reasons or volitional reasons.